In 2020, I was asked to give an interview on how I came to Sahaja Yoga for the documentary Storia di Evoluzione al Femminile, Stories of Women's Evolution, filmed in Italian with English subtitles. The film is about women who, by seeking and nurturing their inner being, have overcome their own fears and can now face life with greater courage and self-esteem. This interview you will see in part 1 of my memories, which were not exactly golden at the time. It's called Elizabeth's Story in the film. Part 2, that I have entitled A Sahaja Pilgrim's Progress, Protection, Tapasya, Miracles and Blessings, describes the way in which I was guided, protected, comforted and cured by the divine power that time after time prevented me from going in the wrong direction before taking me by the hand and bringing me to Sahaja Yoga. Indeed, even the darkest clouds have a silver lining, thanks to our beloved Mother, who is always guiding, protecting, and looking after us, her children.
Io mi chiamo Elizabeth Matthews, sono nata e cresciuta in Inghilterra e dopo la laurea all'università in Inghilterra ho sposato un francese e mi sono trasferita in Francia. Mi sono trovata incinta quasi subito e dopo pochi mesi, all'autunno, una mattina mio marito mi dice: ma io voglio suicidarmi e voglio che tu lo facessi con me. Era una cosa che non posso neanche descrivere, perché non avevo nessuna conoscenza di queste malattie nervose, depressive. Ero molto innocente, avevo 22 anni, molto giovane. Non ho capito cosa succedeva, ma parlandone col medico di famiglia, della famiglia di mio marito, mi ha detto che mio marito era quello che adesso si chiama bipolare, cioè a quel momento lì era maniaco depressivo, che corrisponde infatti molto di più a quello che aveva lui. Perché ogni inverno, già dall'autunno, cominciava a essere depresso. Andava giù e giù e giù, fino a quando faceva una tentativa di suicidio. Poi l'estate era il contrario. A primavera cominciava ad essere quello che chiamavo normale, una persona molto sensibile, molto educato, una persona intelligente, normale. Era anche lui insegnante come me e sembrava tutto bene. Poi andava avanti nell'estate, diventava iperattivo, aggressivo, prepotente, a volte violento. Allora l'estate non avevo scelta, dovevo subire la rabbia sua e basta. Il problema era che io da sola in Francia non avevo né famiglia né amici, perché ero lì da qualche mese, infatti. Ero incinta e ero da sola, proprio da sola. Dopo 2 o 3 anni di questa serie di depressione e di iperattività, gli ho detto che non ce la facevo più, che volevo partire e portare i miei figli, perché avevo 2 figli adesso, portarli via in Inghilterra. Lui si è arrabbiato tanto e mi ha minacciato di ammazzarci tutti e 3, io e i miei figli, se mai io partivo. Cosa potevo fare? Ero da sola e in più lui era cacciatore, aveva dei fucili e a partire di quel momento lì, infatti, lui metteva un fucile sotto il letto, sempre. Avevo veramente paura, in più della solitudine, perché trovarmi da sola, non poter parlare a nessuno di quello. Ma per i miei figli mi sono detta che non potevo lasciare tutto, non potevo non fare niente. Allora mi sono rimessa a studiare. Avevo già la laurea di francese. Mi sono detta, ma facendo una laurea di inglese posso insegnare e così almeno sarò un po' più indipendente. Nel 79 hanno introdotto il divorzio in Francia. Sono andata a trovare un avvocato che mi ha detto ma perché non è andata via prima? L'ho guardato dicendo ma se vi raccontavo non credereste neanche. Ma non ho potuto. Ecco, sono rimasta 10 anni così perché era necessario, ma adesso voglio il divorzio. Ho avuto il divorzio nel 79, anche se avevo un po' paura delle sue reazioni, ho scelto di vedere l'avvocato quando lui era ricoverato, infatti depresso, perché sapevo che a quel momento lì non ci sarebbe violenza, ecco. E il tempo che esce della sua cura eravamo già quasi divorziati. E nell'80, dopo il divorzio, ho portato via i miei figli e ci siamo trasferiti a Ginevra, dove mi hanno dato un posto di insegnante in un liceo internazionale francese, ma in confine con Ginevra, la Svizzera. Allora per 10 anni ho cresciuto da sola i miei figli. Ma un anno dopo la mia trasferta a Ginevra mio ex marito si è suicidato. E quello ha provocato tanti problemi psicologici per i figli. Mia figlia aveva 13 anni e era diventata molto ribelle. Non c'era niente da fare con lei, non potevo dire niente, fare niente per lei. Mio figlio invece, che aveva un anno di meno, lui si è chiuso su se stesso. Non lavorava più a scuola, non parlava più, non ha neanche pianto quando suo papà si è suicidato. Allora mi sono lanciata a capofitto nel lavoro, lavoravo tanto e facevo tutte le attività che avevo fatto già in Inghilterra da giovane. Facevo teatro, facevo tennis a un livello abbastanza alto e l'estate andavo in montagne perché ero vicino alle montagne del Giura, le Alpi, intorno a Ginevra. L'inverno facevo sci di fondo, avevo tante attività che non avevo più tempo di pensare ai miei problemi e tutto. Solo che diventava un po' troppo. E un giorno che facevo una camminata nelle montagne Giura con una collega e mi ha detto: sai che cosa? Io ho trovato uno yoga di meditazione che ho cominciato e mi sembra che anche a te interesserebbe. Perché io, come lei, mi ero molto interessata al buddismo e alla pace interiore che sembrava trovare la gente, i contadini in Asia, per esempio, che praticava il buddismo. Allora lei mi ha passato il libro di Grégoire de Kalbematten, un diplomatico svizzero che era stato con Shri Mataji, Nirmala Devi, a Londra negli anni 70, dove introduce e parla di Sahaja Yoga. Era così che si chiamava questo yoga. Io ho letto questo libro che si chiama L'Avvento e subito ho capito che era per me e ho chiesto alla mia collega di farmi incontrare il gruppo svizzero a Ginevra che praticava questo yoga. Ho dovuto aspettare un po' di mesi perché era l'estate e c'era nessuno in giro, ma alla fine mi ha invitata a casa con un'altra signora, amica sua, e 4 o 5 yogi, 4 o 5 praticanti di Sahaja Yoga di Ginevra. E lì ci hanno alzato la Kundalini, dato la realizzazione. Dopo l'esperienza, un yogi ha detto: avete delle domande? E la signora ha detto sì. Avanti, domanda. E tu, mi dice? Io no. non avevo niente proprio in mente. Ero completamente senza pensieri, perché avevo trovato questa pace interiore che cercavo da tanti anni e non c'era niente da dire, mi sentivo così bene, non sentivo più il bisogno di fare tutte le attività di prima, di correre a destra, a sinistra. Dentro di me c'era tutto, c'era il silenzio, la pace. Avevo trovato veramente quello che mi serviva, la pace interiore. E questo grazie solo a questo yoga. A partire di quel momento lì mi sono messa a leggere tutto quello che trovavo, dei discorsi di Shri Mataji, Nirmala Devi, ai yogi inglesi negli anni 70, perché questi discorsi sono veramente le basi di Sahaja Yoga, dove lei spiega chi siamo, come dobbiamo lavorare su di noi e a che cosa serve questa realizzazione del sé e questo yoga. Leggendo tutti questi discorsi ho capito l'importanza della donna, di tutte le donne, nella società, nella famiglia. E infatti ho cominciato a fare un po' di introspezione su di me. Se mi sono lasciata prendere in questa fase la prima fase di sottomissione, di depressione, tutto, era perché non avevo stima di me, non mi rendevo conto dell'importanza del ruolo che ha la donna in famiglia, in società, nel mondo. Ero in esaurimento nervoso, emotivo a quel momento lì. E il modo poi che ho scelto per uscire di questa fase qua era l'iperattività, fare tutte queste attività, sport, viaggi, teatro, eccetera, per dimenticare le cose che non andavano in me. Volevo credere che io fossi qualcun altro, qualcuno di forte, di potente, ma dentro di me c'era ancora questo lato fragile. Infatti ho creato un disequilibrio dentro di me, perché dalla depressione di prima sono andata fino allo stress, l'azione, il movimento frenetico. E non è questo disequilibrio che ci porta alla pace interiore. Non è così che noi possiamo essere veramente noi stessi. Per essere noi stessi, noi donne, dobbiamo essere centrati, al centro, né depressi, né iperattive. Siamo la pace stessa, siamo come una fortezza che sostiene la famiglia, che sostiene la società. E questo ho vissuto nella mia vita, tutte queste esperienze. Ho capito che è solo con Sahaja Yoga che ho trovato il mezzo di essere me stessa prima e di poter aiutare quelle che sono tantissime come me e hanno vissuto delle cose molto brutte. Allora vi posso dire di cuore, veramente, che alla mia età, più di 70 anni, sono 34 anni che pratico questo yoga, che mi sento veramente felice e la pace interiore, il silenzio c'è anche quando ci sono problemi, se noi sappiamo essere in equilibrio.
At the time of my divorce in France in 1979, I had never heard of Sahaja Yoga or Shri Mataji, who at that time was in London looking after a group of hippies, a few of whom were French. Until they were fully established, Sahaja Yoga could not spread in Europe, except in Switzerland, where Grégoire de Calbermatten had brought his brother, sisters, and friends to Sahaja Yoga and formed a group who were meditating in Geneva. And quite by chance, in 1980, the French Ministry of Education appointed me to teach at the International High School on the Swiss-French border, just 15 minutes drive from the center of Geneva. I couldn't understand why I was being sent there at the time, especially as I had applied for a posting to another French international school at Valbonne, near Nice in the south of France. Little did I know that I was being directed to Geneva because there I would get my realization. During my summer vacation in 1982, I went to visit my brother who was living in Hong Kong, where he was chief architect for what was still a British colony at the time. I explored southern China before flying to Thailand and touring the whole country in a jeep with several other people of different nationalities. One of the highlights of the trip was traveling down the Mekong River in a friendly Thai villager's rice boat as far as Burma, Myanmar, to visit villages in the Golden Triangle in the north of Thailand, where they still cultivated and smoked opium. One of my fellow travelers was a Belgian scientist whose hobby was visiting a different part of the world every summer and filming a documentary about it that was then shown to the general public at a cinema in Belgium. He would give a lecture on the destination and answer questions from the audience while the film was showing. More than a year later, Marcel, the Belgian scientist, contacted me. to say that he wanted to film a documentary in India about the different religions in Kashmir. That is, Muslims in Srinagar, Buddhists in Ladakh, and Hindus on their annual pilgrimage to Amarnath in the Himalayas. He had understood from our conversations in Thailand that I was fascinated by India and also by Buddhism. Would I be interested in helping him do research for the film and then accompanying him on the trip to act as his interpreter while he was filming? Of course. The first photo was taken in Srinagar on the houseboat on Lake Dal where we stayed. These beautiful boats were originally holiday homes for the families of British government officials when India was part of the British Empire. We visited floating markets, admired local products and handicrafts in workshops, transported to customers on boats like canoes called sikaras, the local taxi service. Then the 5-day pilgrimage up the Himalayas to the cave in Amarnath, where Sri Shiva told Sri Parvati the secret of eternal life. Hindu tradition has it that this secret was overheard by a parrot. So Sri Shiva transformed the parrot into a block of ice to stop it talking. In the cave, there is usually a large Shiva lingam made of ice, and next to it a smaller one. But when we were there, both of them had melted. By the way, Sahaja yogis prefer to think that the smaller lingam is in fact Sri Ganesha, not a parrot. So this trip was planned for August 1985. And for a whole year beforehand, I was doing research to prepare for it. I had even made an appointment with the Dalai Lama at his ashram in Switzerland, partly for information about Tibetan Buddhism, but also for my own purposes. Appointment, July 1984. Great! At last I could find out more about how to achieve inner peace. But then a letter came from the Ministry of Education with the dates when I would have to be examining students in Lyon. I would be working full-time in July. There was absolutely no way I could get to Lausanne for my appointment. Disappointed, I set about looking for an alternative. Eureka! We would be in Leh, the capital of Ladakh, on August the 15th, the Indian Independence Day. On that day every year, villagers came from all over Ladakh to welcome the Dalai Lama, who would be visiting the Buddhist monks in Leh. In the afternoon, the doors of the monastery were always opened for a public audience. Hooray! On the mountain pass marking the border between Kashmir and Ladakh, there is a shrine to Maitreya, the goddess worshipped by Ladakhi Buddhists. Maitreya means the three mothers, Shri Mahakali, Shri Mahasaraswati, and Shri Mahalakshmi. In other words, she is the Trigunatmika. As we came over the pass on a local bus, we saw a goat herd. But there was no sign of goats, and there was no grass for them to eat. Villagers had come from all over Ladakh, dressed in their traditional costumes to celebrate Independence Day and welcome the Dalai Lama to Leh. Peasants, like the man spinning his prayer wheel, praying as he waited, Buddhist monks in all their regalia. We saw the Dalai Lama's car arrive and drive along the main street to the monastery. But there was no sign of the man himself. We were there all afternoon, waiting for the monastery doors to open, but they never did. For the second time, I was unable to meet the Dalai Lama. In autumn 1985, the English Dramatic Society in Geneva was putting on the play Old Times by Harold Pinter, and I was playing one of the three characters in it. Our play was then chosen to represent Switzerland at an international English drama festival in Holland. There would be performances of different plays on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at the Convention Centre in The Hague. On arrival, we checked the programme to find out when we would be on stage. 8 p.m. on Saturday. Okay, great. I turned around, and there, on the door of the conference hall opposite, was an enormous poster. On Saturday at 8 p.m., the Dalai Lama in person would be giving a talk and a public audience. Incredible. Mother had organized everything. For the third time, I had been saved, even though I was still totally unaware of the danger I'd been in. Shortly after that, I got my self-realization and began meditating with the Sahaja yogis in Geneva in the new year, 1986. It wasn't easy for Sahaja yogis to teach in a French state school at that time, as we were being persecuted by an association called ADFI, and their accusations had led to Sahaja Yoga being added to a government list of dangerous sects to be kept under special surveillance by the Secret Service. Any reference to Shri Mataji and Sahaja Yoga or wearing a medallion with Mother's photograph would lead to complaints to the government from the fathers of our students, many of whom were diplomats at the United Nations in Geneva and could cause serious trouble. So, to try and spread vibrations in the school, I gave one international class of 16 and 17-year-olds a group project to do. Together, we studied a number of peace activists and Nobel Prize winners, all of them realized souls. Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, etc. Then each group chose one of these inspiring figures and created posters with photos and information about all of them for an exhibition in the school hall for everyone to see. There was a parents-teachers meeting in school around that time, and I even got complimentary remarks from one or two diplomats. So this project must have helped to improve vibrations as I had hoped it would. My first encounter with Shri Mataji in person was in spring 1986, when she came back to Europe from India and was giving a public program at the university in Geneva. After her talk, Mother invited the new people in the audience to come up on stage, and I joined the queue. When it was my turn to meet her, I knelt down in front of her with joined hands as if in prayer. The Swiss yogi standing beside her said, "Mother, this is a new Sahaja yogini." She looked at him and said, "I know." Then took my joined hands in hers with a radiant smile, full of love and tenderness, like a mother holding a little child's hand to support him when he's learning to walk, just as she had protected me for so many years. Overcome with emotion, I could hardly speak. All I could say was, "Thank you, Mother. Thank you." In 1988, the Swiss yogis decided to open a Sahaja primary school in Tanning near Geneva for their own children and one or two others from different countries. And they asked me to be their English teacher. I was already teaching full-time at the lycée, but I had no classes on Wednesdays, and I usually spent that day marking students' work and preparing lessons. If I went to Tane on Wednesdays, I would have to do all my marking on weekends. What is more, I'd never taught such small children before, but after all, why not? I would be learning new skills just like them. Above all, when Shri Mataji came for the official opening ceremony at the school, I was there with the teachers, so I was fully compensated for giving up my free day. So here we have Shri Mataji looking at the present that the children have made for her. And we, the teachers, are on Mother's right. She then takes the scissors, cuts, cuts the ribbons to open the school, and there are more presents from the children coming. That was a beautiful memory. On the 15th of August 1988 was the opening of the school. At about that time, my mother fell ill with lymphoma. She had one tumor on her center heart and another in her throat, and had to undergo chemotherapy, then radiotherapy that burned her vocal cords. leaving her practically voiceless and extremely weak. The cancer specialist in England, where she still lived, told her she would never be able to speak normally again. Not only that, but my brother, who was only 38 years old, was diagnosed with brain cancer and would have to undergo an operation in Hong Kong. My mother was desperate when she phoned to tell me the news. But she sensed that I was not as upset as she had expected me to be, and wanted to know why. So I told her how I had discovered Sahaja Yoga and got my realization. Described the effect that my encounter with Shri Mataji had on me. She asked me to send her the only book about Sahaja Yoga that existed at that time, The Advent. So I posted it off to her straight away, even though I couldn't help wondering whether she'd be able to cope with Grégoire's philosophizing in the final chapter. However, I was mistaken. The next time she called me, she had already read the whole book 2 or 3 times. And her only comment was, I thought I was the one and only person to think like that nowadays. Then she asked if she could come to Geneva with my father to get her realization. They came to stay with me, and I told them absolutely everything that I had learned about Sahaja Yoga in the 6 months. The 6 months I'd been meditating, including the fact that Shri Mataji is the Holy Spirit. My mother came to the collective meditation in Geneva with me, and the yogis gave her realization. I made copies of all the documents I had for her to take home, including Mother's talks that I was helping to transcribe. After returning home, she tried to meditate on her own for a while, but there was no one to help her, and she gave up trying. However, she always had a photo of Shri Mataji with her, and above all, Mother was in her heart. She went to her regular checkup with the cancer specialist, and he asked her if she'd been having something different in the way of treatment since he had examined her last. She told him that she had started doing Sahaja Yoga, but no new treatment. Whatever you do, keep it up. You're getting better, he said. At her next appointment, miraculously, both the tumor on the center heart and the one in her throat had vanished. Her vocal cords were cured, and she could speak normally. She was 65 at that time, and for 20 years after that, there was no trace of the lymphoma that she'd been suffering from. Then, in 2008, it returned in the form of breast cancer, and she passed away 2 years later at the age of 88. She had been born on the 22nd of February, 1922, 13 months before Shri Mataji came on this earth. And she passed away on the 10th of December, 2010, 3 months before Shri Mataji departed. My mother's spirit had achieved its aim. She had recognized and worshipped the Adi Shakti in her heart. even though she had never met her in person. Dear Shri Mataji. My brother lived for 10 years with brain cancer. He had several operations, and for the last 2 years of his life, he was paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair. After his second operation in 1986, I traveled to Hong Kong to spend some time with him and give my sister-in-law and my 2 nieces some support and time off. Every afternoon, I went to see him in hospital. We talked, and I read to him until he fell asleep. One day, while he slept, I raised his kundalini, put him in bandhan, and prayed to Shri Mataji to bless him by granting him self-realization. Despite the fact that he was fast asleep, he must have felt his kundalini in Sahasrara, because he raised his right hand and massaged his fontanelle bone as he slept. Such a beautiful occurrence that I will never forget. Shri Mataji. I spent Christmas 1987 on my first Sahaja India tour of Maharashtra with the yogis from Switzerland. I enjoyed singing with them for Shri Mataji and meeting yogis from Australia and New Zealand, as well as many other countries. Here we are of 4 different nationalities, the yoginis with Mother on the stage. At the back is Judy Doby from Australia. Then there is Laurence Saraswati Kestraputra, me, and Xavier Valderrama's daughter, who was very young at the time, like Laurence, like Saraswati, who was a student of mine, in fact. Okay, this was another beautiful experience of everybody on the stage with Mother. The tour ended in Ganapati Pule, and there for the first time, I watched the Sahaja marriage ceremony. It was magical, like being in a dream or a fairy story, so bright, colourful, and full of joy. Nothing like the nightmare I had been through in my own marriage. However, once bitten, twice shy, as they say, I definitely didn't want to risk another disaster of this kind. I couldn't face it. I was allergic to the very idea of marrying again. No more marriages for me. The 1988 India tour started early, and I couldn't get time off school before the Christmas holidays. So I flew from Geneva to Mumbai with Matthias Kaluzny, who was in a similar situation. Then we hired a taxi to take us to Pakistan. The taxi dropped us off with our suitcases not far from a big tent. Strangely enough, there was no one around, but it didn't take us long to find out why. We had arrived in the middle of a puja and Mother was already there. I dumped my luggage outside the temple and sneaked into a corner at the back of the tent, feeling very conspicuous and uncomfortable, as I wasn't wearing the sari and I wasn't feeling at all fresh after the journey. At the end of the puja, while Mother was giving out presents, I decided to take my suitcase up to the smaller tents and find a place where I could freshen up and change into a sari. I was about to do so when two yogis appeared. I didn't know either of them. What were they doing in the ladies' tent? One of them, who turned out to be Sahaja, the leader in Milan, asked me, "Are you Elizabeth from Switzerland?" "Yes." "Why?" "This is your husband, Nicola." "What?" It was such a shock. I must have gaped at them incredulously because I hadn't filled in a marriage application. My previous marriage had lasted for 10 extremely traumatic years, and I was bringing up my two children, who were now teenagers, on my own. Yet, for some reason, I couldn't react. I couldn't protest. I just surrendered. That was probably due to the effect of the puja, but also because nobody had said anything to me beforehand, as I had arrived during the puja and not seen or spoken to anyone. Mother, once again, had organized everything in such a way that I just couldn't react. This was confirmed when Nicola and I did namaskar to Shri Mataji before the wedding. She looked at me with a sweet, loving smile on her face and said, "Don't think." Here's Nicola with me at our wedding. And this is the photograph where Mother is saying, "Don't think," to me. You can imagine how I was feeling. There we are. So our wedding was in Ganipatipule on the 28th of December, 1988. At the end of the next school year, in July 1989, I moved to Milan, where Nicola was working as a technical designer and began teaching English and preparing courses for adults at a language school near the Bocconi University. We were so blessed that summer. Every weekend, the whole collective from Lombardia, gathered at the Garlati ashram near Lecco on the banks of Lake Como. When Shri Mataji came to do a public program in Milan, she stayed at the ashram and allowed us to worship her as Shri Bhairava in the magnificent park by the lake. That was the one and only opportunity I ever had to do Lakshmi Puja to the goddess in person. And I thank our Divine Mother from the bottom of my heart for having allowed me to do so. Can we see the three photos, please? Mother Shri Bhairava Puja. The following year, 1990, Shri Mataji did public programs in sports stadiums all over Eastern Europe. In every country, thousands of people came to listen to her and get their self-realization. In summer, there were yogis accompanying her who remained in each country after the programs to do follow-ups. But in September, they had to go back to work, so extra help was needed. I was about to change jobs. The director of another language school where Jeremy and Victor were working had offered me a job that September. But Jeremy persuaded him that it would be better for me to start in October. And so I went to Sofia in Bulgaria to do follow-ups twice a week for more than 200 people in the main lecture theatre at the university. Vibrations were fantastic when we did collective workshops with so many people. Long lines of seekers giving vibrations and working on the person in front of them. Programs were in English or French, depending on who was to be my interpreter each time. Among the interpreters were a couple who worked for the Bulgarian national television. And they interviewed me about Shri Mataji and Sahaja Yoga on a public bench in the street so that they could show it on TV. Quite a novel experience. These are the yogis, the new yogis in Bulgaria when we were going up the mountain to do a puja. Here they are after the puja. I'm there with them at the back. And here is that interview carried out in the street by the couple of journalists. This is the second year. The following year, I went back to Bulgaria with Nicola and John, who was Australian, Silvana from Italy. And there were four of us this time. And so we also traveled to different places, as there were several of us, to do public programs. So I traveled to Pernik and Varna, where they were giving public programs, but they would never let me contribute to expenses. Bulgaria was without doubt the poorest country in Eastern Europe at that time. There was never much to buy in the shops. Most of the time, there was only tinned food on the shelves. And in the markets, there would be just potatoes one day and onions the next, for example. How people survived was a mystery. And yet every morning, the lady I was staying with gave me fresh Bulgaria yogurt and fruit for breakfast. How did she manage it? I discovered later that one young yogi drove a taxi. As petrol was rationed, every day and all night, if necessary, he would queue at the petrol station to fill up so that he could drive up into the mountains to get yogurt and fruit for my breakfast. Several of those early yogis I met in Bulgaria have married in Sahaja Yoga and have lived in France, Spain, or Canada ever since then. Sometimes I have seen them at a puja in Kabbalah. Such humble, generous people, so enthusiastic and open-hearted. It's a blessing to have such lovely brothers and sisters. In 1991, Shri Mataji bought Palazzo Doria in Kabbalah, and there was a tremendous amount of renovation work to be done on it. For several years running, we rented a little house on the other side of the river so that at weekends we could come down from Milan to help in the castle. Then came Mani Pulite, the clean hands crisis, during which top managers in Italy were arrested for corruption and lots of smaller businesses had to close down, including the one Nicola worked for. By now, he was 45 years old, and however hard he tried, it was impossible to find another job. My salary too was cut in half because the language school had lost some of our biggest clients. As I'd been employed by the French government to be able to move to Milan, I had applied for 6 years temporary retirement, but that was now coming to an end. If I didn't return to teach in France, I would lose my job and a salary that was twice what I'd been earning in Milan. Nicola didn't want to leave Milan, and the vibrations weren't at all clear. What should I do? Asked Mother. Her answer was clear-cut. As I still had a teaching post in France, I should go back there. So for the beginning of the school year in 1995, I returned to teach at the international school on the border with Switzerland. And after 2 months alone in Milan, Nicola joined me there. We remained in France until I retired, only returning to Italy for pujas in Cabela and to visit Nicola's family in Milan. In France, Nicola could only find odd jobs to do for yogis or my colleagues, and it was obvious that he was dissatisfied with the situation. Unfortunately, the nabby problems he had always had were getting worse. But he refused to go to the specialist appointments I made for him, and he now had very high blood pressure. At Christmas 2006, I retired and we moved back to Italy, but he still refused to see a specialist. When we eventually agreed to have a gastroscopy 3 years later, the cancer had spread to his whole stomach, which had to be removed. And he then had to undergo both chemotherapy and radiotherapy. At our home in the mountains of Liguria, he found the peace and quiet that helped him from a Sahaja point of view. In the early morning of December the 24th, 2012, he suffered a stroke. By the time we got down to emergency, his right side was paralyzed and he could no longer speak. Then the Ganas took over. While we were waiting for the doctor to bring us news of his test results, we were alone in a small room in the emergency ward. And I was able to give him vibrations, say the mantras out loud, and pray Mother to help him. Nicola seemed calm and serene, not at all agitated. In the evening, he was taken up to a room where there was an elderly patient and his daughter who was visiting him. I chatted briefly with her in the corridor while the doctor was examining Nicola. When the doctor had finished, he called me into his room to tell me that Nicola's situation was stable, but that it would be up to him to decide whether he wanted to carry on living in such a miserable condition. An emergency call for the doctor. He was right. Nicola had made up his mind. He had left us. It was 7:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, and the Christmas puja was just starting in Kabela. Nicola had chosen to join his brothers and sisters worshipping at the lotus feet of our Divine Mother. On Christmas Day, the lady I had spoken to at the hospital came to see me. She told me that while I was with the doctor, she had gone back into the room to see her father, and Nicola had smiled at her and waved his hand. She went to her father's bed, bent over him, and for a few minutes her back was turned on Nicola. When she turned round, he had stopped breathing. He was convinced that he was not waving at her. But before leaving, he was saying goodbye to me with a smile. From the expression on his face, we could see that he was peaceful and serene. Thank you, Mother, for your love and infinite compassion. Dear Shri Mataji. In April 2014, my father, who was living with me, passed away shortly before his 95th birthday. I was now alone up in my mountain refuge, free to go to all the pujas in Kabela, public programs in Liguria, do inner peace in Paris and London, and a Sahaja Yoga course for foreign students at the university in Genoa. I was so happy to be a full-time yogini at last. In winter, I escaped the snow and ice at home by visiting my daughter and family near Lyon. My son and his family on l'île de Ré, an island just off the Atlantic coast near La Rochelle. I was invited to Brittany and Normandy by friends and yogis, to Geneva by friends and colleagues, and by yogini to Toulouse in southwest France. It was wonderful to see people and places that I loved and hadn't seen for more or less 8 years. In 2017, I spent 2 months in Asia. 1 week in Delhi and Agra with a Swiss yogini, another week with the yogis in Bangkok, then a few days with my Thai sister-in-law who also lives in Bangkok, before we traveled together down to Hua Hin on the south coast of Thailand, where she and my nieces have a holiday home, then on to Laos. After that, a week visiting my niece Zoe and yogis Deborah, Hannah, and Jivan in Yangon, Myanmar, and a trip to Bagan in the north. Finally, Cambodia, to see Angkor Wat, before flying on to Melbourne in Australia, where Amber, my other niece, was working at the time. We had a wonderful weekend together exploring the wild south coast of Australia. And after a week in South Australia, I flew to Uluru to worship Shri Ganesh. Here we are in Uluru. Visitors can explore only this side of the rock. The other side, where the Aborigine men perform their sacred rites and worship, is their private property. In this picture, we see a little Ganesha who has been bathing in a pool on the rock after some welcome rain. The caves on this side of the rock are open to the public. This is where Aborigine boys are taught about their Dreamtime culture by the older men. The walls of the caves are their blackboard, covered in paintings of their culture. The orange rocks change color during the day. They become red and then brown as the sun goes down. Jai Shri Ganesh. Before Christmas 2018, I drove to where my daughter Françoise and family live near Lyon, as I had done since my father died, to stay with the grandchildren while my daughter and son-in-law were skiing in the Alps and visiting his family up until New Year. When I arrived, Françoise immediately made me feel unwelcome by ignoring me or behaving as if she was still an adolescent in crisis. So, as soon as I could, I drove on to the Ile de Ré, where I spent 3 peaceful weeks on the island with my son Stefan and family. He was 16 and Françoise was 17 when I got my self-realization. And although Stefan has never wanted to try Sahaja Yoga, he respects my ideas and values. And when I suggested teaching his daughters, 12 and 13 now, to meditate on the beach when they were overexcited, he welcomed the idea. So I was able to give them realization. He appreciates the benefits of meditation, even though he will probably never do it himself. Vibrations on the island are beautiful in winter because it's not overcrowded with tourists, and I really enjoyed that stay. From there, I drove down to Cahors in southwest France to stay with Lisa, a French yogini who used to live near Geneva like us. Together, we did 3 weeks of wellness, meditating and working intensively on our subtle systems. And when I left for an 8-hour drive back to my daughter's place, I was absolutely full of cool vibrations. My intention was to pick up a suitcase I'd left with her and maybe spend the night there before driving back over the Alps to Italy. Afterwards, my daughter was alone in the house when I arrived and became aggressive as soon as she saw me. She obviously couldn't stand my vibrations. I was shocked, shaken, and upset, to say the least of it. And despite the fact that the roads were icy and jammed with Parisians on their way to skiing resorts in the Alps, I decided to leave immediately. Without Mother's help and protection, I could never have managed to drive back home over the Mont Blanc to Liguria. I was in such a state. For 3 months after that, I struggled with a very heavy left side. I did my best to work on it, but there seemed to be no way out of the tunnel. That summer, I came home after Guru Puja in Cabello with flu and bronchitis that I'd never suffered from since I was a child. At the end of October, I was in Sestri Levante with another yogini, Laura, trying to organize a public program there. When I got up from table after lunch, I fainted and started to vomit. So I was taken to the emergency unit at the hospital. Apparently, the results of the test they did were normal, so they just gave me a blood transfusion and sent me home. But that night, I collapsed again, and my blood pressure was so low that I couldn't get out of bed or eat anything. My family doctor just prescribed vitamins, but By the fourth day, I was getting weaker and weaker, and I began to see flashing lights like little angels all around me. I really thought my last hour had come. I was taken down to emergency again in semi-intensive care this time, and in the bed next to me was a lady from Val Borbera, Cabela. So I talked to her about Shri Mataji and Sahaja Yoga. To cut a long story short, they discovered that I had a tumor at the top of my stomach between my left nabby and my heart, and it was bleeding. Ruha Lakshmi, peace, serenity in the family, which didn't exist in my family. Heart chakra, the mother-daughter relationship, which was so difficult. So, at the end of November, they removed half my stomach to avoid contamination from the tumor that had been bleeding. On Christmas Eve 2018, the specialist announced to me that all was well, that I wouldn't need chemotherapy or radiation because I was cured. I just had to do the checkups and tests that I'm still doing at regular intervals today. For me, it is obvious that Mother was present throughout this ordeal, showing me how dangerous attachments can be, either to family or to anything else. I'm doing my best to destroy this conditioning and forgive my daughter, whom I have had no further contact with for 5 years now. In hospital, I meditated all day, every day. I read Mother's talks, and my attention was always on her. I surrendered everything to her. Mother, your will be done. Other patients and even the nurses asked me how I managed to remain so calm. Wasn't I scared? They could feel the strength that Mother's attention and protection gave me. A book about Sahaja Yoga with a photo of Shri Mataji on the cover was always on my bedside table when I wasn't reading it. Who knows? Maybe someone might have got vibrations or even realization from that photo. You might think I'm exaggerating when I say that this experience was precious and enriching for me. I felt no pain, only divine love and protection. I was just a baby in my mother's arms, a truly golden memory. Shri Mataji, praise be to you, who is our sweet and mother and loving mother. Praise be to you for guiding us through the labyrinth of life. Jai Shri Mataji.